Goals. On the 1st of January, in technical terms, then the Millennium Development Goals were retired. There's lots of work going on to measure the degree to which they were achieved, which parts of the world they were achieved in, how we can understand the levels of achievement that occurred. But on that same day, the Sustainable Development Goals started. And basically what I'm looking at in this lecture is what it tells us about global governance. There are many colleagues at Bradford who could give you excellent lectures on the concept of global governance, but I'm just seeing it in a way as being about the way the world is run, the way that we function internationally in trying to guide the world, and particularly in terms of trying to guide development. And there are a number of ways that you could actually see this, extreme ways. If you look at the speeches of Ban Ki-moon, then we've had a transformation. The Millennium Development Goals have achieved a lot, and the Sustainable Development Goals will take us into the sort of world that one would want to live in. In development theory terms, some people would call that we've moved from big D to little d. Development is no longer about projects, it's no longer about foreign aid, it's no longer about these micro-level things, it's about the evolution of capitalism, the evolution of international relations, global social norms. It's about the big things that affect everybody's lives. And so that would be a very positive take on the shift to the Sustainable Development Goals. A sort of middle point would be to see them as evolution, that actually the Sustainable Development Goals are progress from the Millennium Development Goals. They're more ambitious, there may be a degree more commitment to them, but seeing it only as evolution, and perhaps seeing it as largely responding to the rising powers, and particularly to the rise of China. So it would see a more marginal move, perhaps social and economic progress, but on a much smaller scale, not transformation. But then there's another perspective. Am I allowed to say this word at Bradford or not? Bull, maybe. If I say the full word at Manchester, then I'm told off, because expletives are removed from podcasts and any video clips of me that the university have. The word is not allowed at Manchester. But anyway, I found it. But bull, I think some of our friends would call it in the USA. There is a critical line of academic argument that would say the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, are really the world's biggest lies. They're these grand promises, these grand visions, which then everybody backs off from. People don't put the money in. They don't change what they're doing. And so there's a series of different positions that one could take. And certainly for me, when I started off looking at the Millennium Development Goals, I was coming from this third position to quite a high degree. I was running the Chronic Poverty Research Centre at the University of Manchester with £10 million of DFID money to look at the household level, at the micro level, about what was happening to poor households in different parts of the world. And in that micro level, that village level and slum level work, it was very hard to see that these Millennium Development Goals, after 5 or 6 years, were making any difference. You couldn't spot bigger budgets. You couldn't spot the IMF or the World Bank changing their policies or changing what was happening. You weren't seeing national governments dramatically changing the way in which they were approaching and supporting poor people or trying to reduce people. And so I started off in a way from a fairly negative perspective, thinking, well, let's look at this macro level poverty rather than the micro level poverty that I've been interested in, and let's see whether there's something in it. But then, as I moved into this and looked through international relations lens and global governance, then one finds that things are quite complicated, and there may be some very progressive things happening, but equally some things that are not so progressive. Now, if you want a bit of theory, I'm only going to give 30 seconds on it, but I'm going to use Robert Cox, and I'll be fairly descriptive and chronological early on, but then I'm going to put things into the concepts of material capabilities, ideas, and institutions. And in a nutshell, what Cox suggests is that if you want to understand what's happening at a particular moment in time on a particular issue, then you need to look at the material capabilities. What capacities are there to convert natural resources through technology and through organisation into products and services, and what capacities are there perhaps to be destructive, to stop others from being able to raise their material capabilities. These interact with ideas, with concepts, with mental constructs, with social norms about what it means to be human, how we should relate, what we should do. And these also interact with institutions, quite commonly organisations where material capabilities, budgets, are given to achieve particular sets of ideas, where sometimes these institutions may not actually take organisational form. When I come to analyse things, then I'll just use this framework. But these things are interacting and they're changing over time. But material capabilities, particularly this application of technology and organisation to produce goods and services, very important. If you wanted 30 seconds on methodology, then I'm sure I could convince you, but I actually find it gobsmacking, I suppose is the right word, how people have managed to develop these frameworks for looking at international relations and global governance. Because when I look at the list of organisations I'm looking at, it's probably over 100,000 organisations that are involved in these sorts of activities. When you look at the meetings, you're looking at millions of different meetings. You're looking across 200 countries. You're looking at a whole set of things. And the methodology I've used is obviously looking at the documentation, but particularly trying to get elite interviews with people who've been heavily involved at different levels in the processes of negotiation of the Millennium Development Goals and their implementation, and subsequently in the Sustainable Development Goals. But that is not an easy thing to do, and one is always likely to have been influenced by particular points of access that one has got and not got others. So I do always invite my audience, please, to give me evidence at the end about where I've got it right or about where I might have got it wrong, because I've only got a tiny part of the evidence that one would need to actually authoritatively talk about these things. Let's, for 10 minutes, take a look at the Millennium Development Goals and just go through a brief history of them. A key thing to understand about the Millennium Development Goals is nobody knew what they were doing when the Millennium Development Goals were created. These super norms, putting all these goals together, was not a process that people understood. So it was a process that was actually invented. But it wasn't invented in 2000 at the millennium. The UN has a history of global goal setting. Ever since it was founded, then people have thought that we can set global goals and somehow use the United Nations General Assembly or different parts of the United Nations to achieve these global goals. Depending on the evidence base that you look, then there's evidence of success, in which smallpox is probably the most cited case. But smallpox is eradicated, and that is amazing progress for humanity. I mean, hundreds of thousands of deaths stopped and millions of lives ruined, stopped by the eradication of smallpox. But there's also been things that have been less successful. Education for All declared a goal over 40 years ago, declared a goal in the Millennium Development Goals, but we're still trying to move towards education for all. It hasn't been something which is able to be anything like achieved during the several periods that it's been defined. So the UN has this history, and usually that was focused on specific areas, on health or on education, women's empowerment, but a regular part of the process. Things changed in the 1980s, in the era of what for development is often called the structural adjustment era, the era when neoliberal ideas informed what should happen, a belief that the market could actually was the institutional base for all development. And during the 1980s, this global goal setting stopped. I put down this no silly talk there, but if you take a look at Margaret Thatcher's autobiography, then she actually reports persuading Ronald Reagan to go to Cancun with her to look at the idea of the new international economic order which the UN had been developing. And she says two things about that. First of all, we stop this silly idea, and then we stop this silly talk of people coming together and talk about global goals. The nation is the only unit that can actually function, so we just don't need any of this UN-type silly talk about global goals. We just need to focus on liberalising our markets at home. Things change in 1990 and throughout the 1990s for a number of reasons that only need to be sketched out. The end of the Cold War certainly meant that political relationships around the world changed, and certainly that Western nations and the USA were much more energetically able to promote the sorts of ideas about democracy and about markets which they believed in. There was a return of UN summits, and the early 1990s saw a whole set. There was pretty much one major UN summit every 4 to 6 months for the first 5 or 6 years of the 1990s, whether we're looking at the Child Summit of 1990 in New York, the first Rio Summit, the Earth Summit of 1992 in Rio, Human Rights in Vienna in 1993, International Conference on Population Development in Egypt in 1994, Social Development in Copenhagen in 1990, a whole series of returns of UN summits, and a great belief that these global debates might lead somewhere. There was the rise of civil society, and actually if you look at these UN summits, then one of the fascinating things, if you look at the media coverage, is it's not the summits themselves that are covered so much, it's what the NGOs and social movements and civil societies are doing in the parallels events that they run, the parallel to the UN summits. And so we've got that happening, declarations galore. Each of these summits ends up usually with pages, with hundreds of declarations about what every nation in the world promises it will do. And so these just build up, we get this accretion. Now, round about the same time, almost in 95, 96, there's a different, well, a subset of people who have a particular problem. This is particularly the OECD, the Club of Rich Nations, and particularly the DAC, their Development Assistance Committee. This is where the Ministers for International Development meet annually, and where the heads of agencies meet twice a year to discuss what's happening in international development, and particularly in foreign aid. And they've got a real problem, and it is that aid is in decline. World leaders have lied. Back in 1990, 1991, when the Cold War ends, they say, the weapons will be beaten into plowshares. We'll put more money into international development and poverty reduction. But now there's no Soviet threat. Everybody just lets their budgets drift down because there's no Soviet threat. And so these people are actually in a pickle. Watch, I don't go into too many fascinating anecdotes, but I did talk to the head of USAID at that phase, and he said, I was really pissed off. I'd spent 30 years to get to the head of this agency. And what am I doing? I just focus every day on laying staff off. Who am I going to lay off? It's nothing about what should I do in Africa, what should I do in Asia, what should I do on health. I'm just working out how do I lay 100 people off next week. That's all I do. I haven't spent my life to be doing this. And so these people are really focused. Accidentally, they create a set of goals called the International Development Goals. They get an intern at the OECD in Paris to look at all of these meetings and come up with a list of goals. And they discuss them and put them through their own political filter, and they come up with a list of international development goals at the back of one of their reports. Nobody knows that report nowadays, but about 80% of the goals that they identified became the Millennium Development Goals. So it's probably one of the best internships if that person was ever able to point at what they achieved through their internship. But the people at OECD did this, said, no, it was just a job for an intern to come up with a neat list that we could all agree. And took off. Things move on though from the OECD, and by 1997-98, Kofi Annan's in, and he's focused. He needs to have a good Millennium General Assembly. The reputation of the UN is going down. It had a lousy 50th birthday at 1997. The General Assembly was seen as very unsuccessful. He's got to focus, and so he wants something big for the millennium. And eventually they end up with a Millennium Declaration, which is quite a long document, a classic UN diplomatic compromise, but eventually that is negotiated into the Millennium Development Goals, a small set of 8 goals with 20 targets. Some people say too long, but it was memorable if you needed to work with it. Many people say that was the United Nations General Assembly. Now, it was actually agreed by an IMF, OECD, UN, and World Bank representatives. They got together and looked at the declaration and pulled it together in consultation with members of the UN General Assembly. And we end up with the 8 Millennium Development Goals. 6 of them are essentially about poverty reduction in poorer countries. It's what's to be achieved in poorer countries. The 7th is about the environment, that we need to move to sustainability. And the 8th is about a global partnership. But that 8th goal, which countries like India were very keen on, says quite a lot about which rich countries are going to do. They say they will increase aid, they say they will make trade fair, they say they will begin to look at the externalities of climate change. After 2001, one gets the gradual adoption of the Millennium Development Goals. Talking with Brian beforehand, and he was saying that he didn't think much happened with them early on, but then late on, there seemed to be some impact. And that's certainly what I would argue. There were early adopters. DFID in the UK was very early on that. Claire Short told every head of division they needed to explain how their budget was going to deliver the Millennium Development Goals. And they had to be able to explain that 100% of their budget was to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. So very quickly DFID took the terms on and had to fit them into their planning, programming, budgeting. At the IMF, a quite different process. I interviewed 3 people at the IMF in 2006, 2007, and they all said pretty much the same thing. We're told to mention the Millennium Development Goals in the introduction to everything, because we are contributing to the achievement of them. But then we don't let them change what happens in our report, because in a way, our model wouldn't cope with that. We need to be reducing public expenditure. We can't invest in health and education. We can't afford it. The countries can't afford it. And so they put them in the introduction, and then they just use their standard models for working out what a medium-term expenditure framework would do. So real differences. But certainly by 2008, 9, 10, you begin to see in aid-dependent countries that actually the talk about reducing poverty, about reducing maternal mortality, about educating children is fitting into budgets, is beginning to change things. Probably the clearest study is one reported by Alice Evans, a Cambridge geographer, who was able to track how the Minister of Health in Zambia was embarrassed at a meeting of Ministers of Health in Southern Africa. Everybody around the table had some evidence indicating that maternal mortality was reducing, apart from him. Zambia was flatlining. And so he went back and took an interest in maternal mortality, was surprised to find that the data was lousy, and tried to get some good data on it, and got some good staff to look at it, and eventually 5 or 6 years later you see the budgets increased and the delivery of maternal and child health services has been focused on and has improved, and the statistics begin to change. So there is adoption, but it's very imperfect and very quite lagged. We're thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, there's a clear message actually coming out of the UN Secretariat, which is don't think about post-2015. Right up until 2012, that's the message. There were awkward academics like myself and Sakiko Fukuda in 2008-9 saying, what comes next? What's the process to get to something better? But at the UN it was, no, we must focus on the Millennium Development Goals. Because if we start thinking about the long-term future, people will not focus on short-term implementation. When we get to 2012, then Ban Ki-moon sets up a process by which the UN General Assembly is to be supported in coming up with a new set of goals. And this is now to be a UN process, not a UN process which the World Bank, IMF, OECD and the UNDP eventually narrow down. It is to be a genuine UN process. He orders a report from UN agencies, and all the UN agencies have to get together and they produce a report called Realising the Future We Want for All, which is the 40+ UN agencies. We then get the high-level panel, the post-2015 development agenda, a new global partnership, chaired by David Cameron, by Ellen Sirleaf-Johnson, and by Bambang Susilo in Indonesia, chaired by 3 national leaders, one from an OECD country, one from Africa, one from Asia, and that produces a set of proposals about the form that the goals might take, and about the principles that should underlie them. That was 28 eminent persons. And one also begins to get the Sustainable Development Goals. The Open Working Group begins to meet in late 2013, and then throughout 2014-15 is discussing these things. The UN agencies report informs things, but doesn't seem to have a big impact. The high-level panel is quite interesting because there were concerns about it, particularly as David Cameron was on it, representing the OECD, and 1/3 of its leadership was coming from the rich world, and the Department for International Development and the Cabinet Office in the UK were providing a lot of the resourcing that was filling into ideas. There were concerns that it would be a fairly conservative type of agenda, but eventually it does come up with ideas about proposing that governance should be improved in all countries, that multidimensional poverty needs to be looked at, and that inequality is an issue that needs to be addressed. Fascinatingly, when I've tried to scratch at why it was a reasonably ambitious document, one comes up with gender as a major reason for it. But this document, produced in 2013, Ban Ki-moon can only have a high-level panel which is gender balanced. But these have to be people who have international recognition, people who have, not just ministerial level, but have been seen in meetings to perform well, highly credible people who are known to be intelligent. And actually, the backgrounds of the 14 women are different from the backgrounds of the 14 men. Quite a group of them come out of the human rights movements, out of women's rights movements, out of backgrounds which are about reducing inequality. And this is not the usual group of people that one gets around the table. So there was a lot more, in a way, radical argument and debate. And certainly, according to some of the people I've interviewed, then, this is not in a pejorative sense, but one person I interviewed said, these mouthy women really changed things. It wasn't the usual sort of UN type of high-level discussion. This was quite intellectualized and pushed forward, particularly with ideas about human rights at the centre of them, because obviously the social structures we have in the world, women don't reach these positions through the same pathways as men reach them, so they came from different backgrounds. And certainly the high-level panel was perhaps more ambitious than many had expected. But it's the open working group which is the powerhouse. It's the open working group that takes things forward. This has come out of a quite different background. The open working group comes out of the Rio Plus 20 process, the meeting in 2012, 20 years after the first Rio meeting, that's been looking at sustainable development, the sort of 20 years after the Earth Summit. And it's at this meeting that certainly Brazil begins to take on a global leadership position supported by other countries, and that the UN General Assembly's G77 begins to focus on using this idea of sustainable development as the way forward. And in 2013, one has this tension. In a way, the high-level panel has come out of the Millennium Development Goals, out of an aid agenda, out of an agenda that comes out of, in a way, the international development institutions in particular. The sustainable development is much more pushed by low-income and middle-income countries in the G77, particularly with this Brazilian leadership looking for something which is going to meet the needs of G77. The G77 actually has 130 members nowadays. So there's this process by which the MDGs, sort of the post-2015 and the SDGs, are competing with each other. The final thing, talk about this in more detail in question, is what did the MDGs achieve? This is very difficult to assess because almost all of the targets that were set for the Millennium Development Goals, then we were making reasonably good progress towards them in 2000, 2001 when they're set, and the base year, which is 1990. Things were getting better between 1990 and 2000 on, I think, almost all of the indicators apart from the environmental goals over that period, and some of the partnership goals. But goals 1 to 6, making progress on them. And what you, in a way, see depends upon what you think the underlying trend was. Certainly, if we look back over the last 15 years, then things have got better in all regions of the world, in all of the MDG goals 1 to 6. And in most parts of the world, they have accelerated. Things have actually improved. But is that due to the declaring of the MDGs and somehow the concept and the idea that they are promoting, or is that just the underlying economic and social processes, technological development, technological diffusion, wealth diffusion, international social norms advances? And so you'll find many of the assessments, some are in a way half full, they'll say the MDGs have contributed, others will say they're half empty because they haven't achieved what they set out to do. I mean, my own judgment is that they did actually advance social and economic progress, but it was already, in a way, steaming ahead according to many of the statistics, and so they have only helped to a marginal degree to take things forward. But it may be the processes of global governance, I'll talk about this in a second, that they have changed most, because this idea of global goal setting has now been institutionalized in particularly sets of global goals. If you want to look at the SDGs, well, as you'll notice, there are quite a lot of them. There's 17 of them, 169 targets. One of the results of going to an open working group. The open working group originally was to have 30 seats that 70 member states of the United Nations would sit in, but eventually it was agreed that it would have 70 seats and that the whole 193 members of the United Nations would have forms of voice into these processes. They were also very open in terms of registering NGOs and civil society groups. And so, in the end, they've gone for a very consensual approach. They've said yes to pretty much any reasonable thing. Almost all of the good things that you could think of in the world have gone into these sustainable development goals. I'll talk a little bit about them in a while, but anyway, basically if you look at them now, then we've got a whole series of poverty-reducing goals from a multi-dimensional perspective. Eradicating income poverty, but also hunger, good health for everybody, good education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation for all, affordable energy. We've got economics and growth, we've got infrastructure, reduced inequalities, a whole set of goals for the environment, and then also peace and justice. The 17th goal is partnerships again. Couldn't resist taking this from the East African. We decided to go with 17 goals and 169 targets. I know many of you wanted less and some of you wanted more. So we decided to go right in the middle, and that way nobody is happy. And it's certainly, true when you look at the assessments, many of the serious assessments are saying this is just overload. You cannot expect countries to be able to take on so many goals. The United Nations Statistical Commission is sitting at the moment, looking at the indicators. They're being guided to come up with as fewer indicators as they can do, but with 169 targets, you're likely to go well above 1,000 indicators. And to imagine that poor countries have a statistical capacity to accurately measure 1,000 statistical indicators is very unlikely. I did talk with Norwegian statisticians about it, and the first draft list, they said, yeah, Norway probably couldn't get these statistics, and if Norway can't get them, then it's going to be quite difficult in Mali to get these statistics. What's changed if we look? Well, we've got a lot more, as I've said. We've got some content changes. Some of them may be relatively, maybe similar small scale. Energy is down, the right to affordable energy. Growth and jobs is down, which is interesting. Growth and jobs was only, jobs was included belatedly 5 years after the Millennium Development Goals were initially agreed, and growth was left out. But growth and jobs are now in this agenda, which is a challenge to the IMF World Bank. The Millennium Development Goals essentially left growth and jobs to the World Bank and the IMF to negotiate with aid recipient countries. This process is suggesting that it may be a broader group of institutions that would be involved in working out how countries achieve growth and jobs. Reducing inequality is in as goal 11, often identified by many of the people I interviewed as the most contentious, as the topic which took the longest to negotiate, at which they had to go latest into the night, at which the amendments were greatest. But other people say that it was goal 16, the peace and justice, or the governance goal, which was the one that was the most heated. There is some confusion at the moment about exactly how this is to be labelled. On the UN site, you'll find the Sustainable Development Goals. Through a process that's only partially understood, Richard Curtis has been asked to make these Sustainable Development Goals more people-friendly. And so there's now a set of global goals which are virtually identical, but actually peace and justice has turned into peace and strong institutions, which some people say is just an easy way of expressing it, and other people say is a totally different concept than justice. So debates about that, but it got in. And then finally this point that there are many, many more environmental goals, a whole set of those. If you look at what else has changed, then these goals are certainly much more holistic. The Millennium Development Goals were about poverty reduction. These goals are about national development, with poverty eradication at the heart of it, but they're also about growth, about infrastructure, about sustainability, and about governance. So these are a very much broader holistic focus. They have this idea of leave no one behind, a real idea that multidimensional poverty eradication is to occur. We won't be satisfied with reducing income poverty by 50%. We have to reduce multidimensional poverty in its entirety. They're universal, they're for all nations. David Cameron was very keen about the concept of leave no one behind, leave nobody behind, being in these goals, that applies to the UK as much as it applies to low-income African countries. At the moment, I'm trying with colleagues at Manchester to do a Leave No One Behind in Manchester report, maybe twinned with colleagues in Dhaka in Bangladesh, because we think it's very necessary to demonstrate that if these are universal, then we should do it. If anybody wants to do that for Bradford, please, I'd love there to be a Leave Nobody Behind in Bradford report. But also, finally, there is this idea of national ownership, that countries will not be expected to photocopy the indicators or the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. They'll be expected to look at them, but then to adapt them to what they believe are relevant national priorities. What's changed in the processes? Really big changes, and the biggest one is that now this sort of super goal setting activity has moved from informal global governance, and the Millennium Development Goals, it was those 4 agencies, the World Bank, IMF, OECD, and representative of the UN from UNDP. They decided what the final list of 8 was. Now it goes, in a way, into the open working group, and it's gone through the UN General Assembly. This has made it much more of a UN document. It's much bigger, but it is actually, it's gone through a globally democratic process, not through some secret deal, which is essentially what the Millennium Development Goals came out of. In a way, no longer is development defined and goals set by rich countries and by aid donors, but all UN member states have had the opportunity to say something about them, and most have taken that opportunity. The MDGs were driven very much by the OECD member needs, and especially by thinking within aid agencies. By 2015, then, development is now part, in a way, of a global agenda which all UN member nations can talk about. It's not so wedded to the aid agenda as it was 15 years earlier. But what's not changed? Quite a few things have not changed. It's a non-binding agreement. Everybody agreed on that with the MDGs, and everybody, before the SDGs were being formulated, agreed that it would be non-binding. This is not a treaty. It cannot be, in a way, expected that countries will pursue it. Countries were very keen to avoid the imposition of the SDGs on them. Another thing that hasn't changed is the concept behind it is results-based management. It is that if you want to get things done, then you set targets, and these targets can be used to get agencies, whether they're public agencies or private agencies, to deliver. They're not really about changing global social norms. They're not about politically negotiating economic or social structural change. They're very much set in this planning and managing and implementing policy framework, particularly a framework that was developed in rich countries trying to reform their public services in the 1990s. And then the final major thing that hasn't changed is global partnership. What has changed is the symbol. Well, the symbol for goal 8 there of the MDGs, which was we're all together, but now we've moved to this Olympic type or nuclear, atomic nucleus type symbol, but the symbol has changed. And certainly Goal 8 was seen as one which was not honoured. The global partnership did not come together. There was relatively little change. The hope that the G20 might somehow do something differently appears to have damped down. So Goal 17 again talks about these unspecified multi-stakeholder partnerships, but whether these will be honoured, whether these will be able to go forward, we'll have to see. How do we explain what's happened there? And I do need to move on now. This isn't actually true what's happened now. Looking at the material capabilities, some people would tell you that, yeah, the Chinese panda is now sitting on the US eagle. Read Joseph Nye's book about the end of the American century. He says it will end, but it'll probably be 2041 or after that America will dominate the world, certainly for another 20 or 30 years. But certainly the panda is looking bigger. And when you try to understand how these content changes and how these process changes have occurred, then changes in material capabilities, the shift of the productive capacity of the world from the west to the east and the south underpins, in a way, this conversion of the Millennium Development Goals into the Sustainable Development Goals. Particularly the rise of the BRICS, and especially the rise of China, and the ambition of Brazil to be a global thought leader has changed the forms of negotiations that occurred. China India, Brazil took relative back seats at the Millennium Development Goal discussions. Brazil, certainly with the open working group format, played a key role in coming up with a format that the developing countries could actually be in the majority. Emerging middle powers have also taken an interest. Colombia, hoping to join the OECD, seems to have been looking at creating symbolic capital, showing that it's a global thought leader, very energetically involved in the open working group and the Sustainable Development Goals concept. Indonesia at times. Turkey played a major role in some of the negotiations and the meetings for what Europe and what Central Asia thought of the Millennium Development Goals and wanted to replace them were held in Istanbul. Africa also, which was very quiet in the MDG processes, was much more assertive. But the economic growth that came in the 2007 onwards in Africa, and access to finance from China and the BRICS, rather than just requiring IMF and World Bank approval before they could get access to finance, meant that African ministers were much more assertive, particularly about growth being important, and particularly about jobs created by growth being important. If we look at ideas, then there's a lot of continuity. Poverty remains a key idea. But a shift from reducing poverty to eradicating poverty, that idea of poverty is informed even more by human development. The concept of human development, very important for the Millennium Development Goals, but even more important for the Sustainable Development Goals. Results-based management still around, partnerships still around, and sustainability is but a much stronger presentation of sustainability. But there's also lots of new ideas. Growth and jobs, often to be inclusive and sustainable, really important idea. But whether we know what inclusive growth is, and whether we know what sustainable or green growth is certainly something which there'll be lots of academic debate, but if we don't try and work these things out, then we may find that climate change is more difficult to deal with than if we do. If we can come up with growth which is not carbon profligate, that would be good. Inequality reduction. This is the one which really surprises me. I was on a group of academics that lobbied UK parliamentarians for 12 months for inequality to be included in the goals. There was another group lobbying for human rights, but both of us thought it was an outside chance. But actually these ideas were taken forward in many countries, and so we did get reducing inequality. But this is the present Oxfam chart of what's happening with inequality, which tells us that the top 1% in around 2015 have almost got half of the world's global wealth. These figures are disputed, but that is the direction that these lines are going. That is indisputable. It's the pace that it's occurring at. But that really was a dramatic inclusion. Peace also comes in. Governance, justice institutions, a whole series of different words used with different concepts behind them. And as I said, this inequality I've already mentioned there. Institutions, well, there's been institutions that have fed into these changes. And certainly one of the things is that the World Bank and the IMF have now a reduced role. This diagram suggests that now low income, but particularly the new middle income and the BRICS countries, along with South Africa, are now increasingly telling the World Bank and the IMF that they need to reform, rather than the 1990s narrative, which was the World Bank and the IMF telling these low income and middle income countries that they needed to reform. The UN has become the arena for super goal setting. 2030, unless there's a dramatic change, then there will be a new set of goals that the UN will agree through a very long deliberative mechanism. There are new actors empowered, some of them are governments, as with Brazil, as with Colombia. The African Union certainly played a much more significant role in the SDGs. There's a whole set of new financial institutions that have arisen and which are able to shape what happens with the Sustainable Development Goals. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, the Contingency Reserve Arrangement. But these new institutions pushed by China or pushed by the BRICS. And then finally, the NGOs, they played a big role in the MDGs, but they played probably an even bigger role in some ways in the formulation of the SDGs. Certainly 1,000 of them formed a group called Beyond 2015 and collaborated and got virtually sort of national member status of UN meetings to talk about what civil society coalitions across the world wanted. I've been looking at this, and I am worried that actually these NGOs now and our NGOs have been very effective professional advocates, real interest group leaders, but that they haven't in any way looked at really mobilizing civil society. They haven't taken the MDGs or the SDGs to mosque groups, to church committees, to women's groups, to trade unions, to cooperatives, that they're engaging at these high levels, but they're not actually thinking about how these ideas might filter down. Is it transformation or evolution? Well, it depends on the framework you use, the criteria that you select, and that. I think in content terms, one could argue transformation. With inequality reduction there, I did not believe it could get in. I really think that's quite an amazing agreement that's gone into a UN agreement which the membership has approved at this stage. Peace and conflict moving in, and indicators for them. Governance and institutions in this deepening of sustainability. If you were to look in process terms, then I wouldn't say transformation for sure. It's still the more powerful nations, it's still those with material capabilities that are able to dominate the thinking. We may now have the BRICS coming in and China able to come in, but you could argue that this has led to some sort of accelerated evolution. But I put down there the end of an interview that I had, and it did make me think about whether, in a way, you need to make sure that we keep the SDGs in perspective. And this actually came from one of the leading OECD envoys at the Sustainable Development Goals General Assembly. I spent 2 hours interviewing this man who'd been heavily involved in all the SDG negotiations for 3 years and that. And at the end, he giggled and he said, but actually, it's all about Paris. It's all about climate change. If we get a good agreement on climate change, it's those negotiations which the world and which the powerful nations of the world are taking seriously. If we get a good deal at Paris, then the Sustainable Development Goals will be able to engage and do something. If we get Paris falling apart in the way that Copenhagen fell apart, then the SDGs will actually just sort of become a long list of things that's constantly mentioned. And so if one took that position, then development may still be not a core part of the international agenda, but the fact that there's been a reasonable agreement at Paris makes it more likely that Sustainable Development Goals can get traction in the near future. So transformation, evolution, well, I mean, to be honest, I think there's bits of both in it, and we're going to have to tease it out. The fact that development is no longer defined by donor nations, I think, is very significant. You could see that as a small move towards transformation, but more evidence will be required. Certainly the SDGs expand the opportunities for progressive change, and I think for many, certainly, civil society movements, NGOs, progressive political parties, maybe national positions, there are opportunities that could be taken forward here. Certainly I think that this concept of leave no one behind is something that if one could see groups taking that forward and beginning to look around the world about how one could actually have local reports, regional and national reports that look at who is not doing well. The world is definitely doing better, but there are many people who are not doing better, that would be one device that we could move forward. But it is material capabilities that explain the changes, much more than ideas. It's not that ideas about inclusivity, sustainability, human rights are raising in power. It is that the sort of evolving nature of global capitalism, which is very closely tied to promoting consumerism, that has restructured, and that restructuring has led to a different form of negotiations. So the players are changing, but I don't think the game has changed. Thank you very much. A shameless advert for a book which has all the answers to the questions I can't answer.